across it, it's just to minimize the waste, keep products and materials in certain loops for as long as possible. So after understanding this problem that we're seeing inside of the circular economy and the biases that we have, we embarked on a journey to use survey data and see whether we can uncover these biases and what are their influences. So we decided that we are going to have a few surveys, and we sent out a few pilot surveys to make sure that the survey is valid and reliable. And then we sent out the surveys to various circular economy stakeholders. This includes some consumers, different businesses, and some policymakers as well. The topics that was covered in our surveys was some decision-making drivers, risk perceptions, information sources, behavioral intentions, and this all formed the foundation for our analysis further. We collected and analyzed the data using Atlas TI, and then this allowed us to identify all the recurring themes and the patterns within the data that we collected. These patterns and themes were then coded into the system dynamics model, and we used that as the quantification, as the actual data used in the model. So I'm just quickly going to try and explain the model to you before we get to the simulation results. There I'm going to spend as much time as we have. So we start with biases, and we have a certain capacity for biases, and we've seen that biases can either be positive or negative. So in literature and in psychology, they use the word supportive and opposing. So a supportive bias would be something that supports a good notion. So for us, the good notion is that there's a perceived need for sustainability and that there's an actual need for sustainability in the environment. There we already have quantifiable data that says we need sustainability. And then we have the opposing cognitive biases. These are the opposite of the supporting biases, and these oppose the need for sustainability. So people already have these mental models formed, and these biases influences those mental models. And in the model, you also see we have two reference variables, one for the supporting cognitive biases. We got that from the data as well, from the survey. There are values for them as well as for the reference sustainability need rate. So we use these reference data from the surveys. We had 79 people that gave us information from the surveys. So we'll spend the last 5 minutes of the presentation almost on this slide. And this is the simulation results. And I want to dive into the results that we got from the surveys to make sure that you understand the complex dynamics of the biases in the circular economy. And so what we did for sensitivity analysis is to run 3 different cases. I'm not sure if you can see it very clearly, but the green one is our base case. So that is straight the data that we got from the surveys. And then just to see how the system and the model will act in different cases, we decided, let's say there's a higher capacity for biases. So we doubled it. So we have from the surveys had just over 1,000 biases from the 79 respondents. And we said, let's double it. Let's say the capacity for a human to have biases is much more. And then for the other one, we decided, let's say we have an initial value for opposing biases much lower. So we made that 100 for the base, or for that lower opposing biases case, and we looked at the behavior of it further. So I'm quickly going to talk you through the 4 graphs. We'll go through a clockwise direction, starting with the biases graph. So this one is the one that I said we doubled the capacity for biases that can happen. So this can be opposing or supporting biases. But what we saw from our simulation is that the opposing biases has a very, very big influence, and the relation between opposing and supporting biases also have a very big influence on the mental models, but we'll get that from the simulation results. So firstly, the biases graph. Let me just explain the S-curve. So we typically see this in a limits to growth model, and this is what we also saw, that as soon as the opposing biases diminish, our whole capacity for biases is then supporting. So the whole full 1,000 would become supporting biases, and we see that our need for sustainability and our perceived need is also reached. But as soon as we increase it, 2,000, that higher capacity, we see that the opposing biases just stops our growth to finding the correct mental model, and it slows us down a bit, and we never reach back to the base case of having the correct mental model for sustainability. So we just need to make sure that that relationship between the opposing and the supporting biases are correct. The second graph, just looking at the supporting cognitive biases, the two variables that we changed is the capacity and the opposing biases. So that's why they all lie so close together. We see that this is a percentage-wise, so we'll have 50% and 100%. So if we have only supportive biases, our mental models are fine. There is a need for sustainability, and the community perceives that there's that need. But as soon as the opposing biases now come in and comes to play a role, it diminishes that need entirely. So that's just to show, to make sure that we really have to focus on increasing that supporting biases part. The one below that, the need for sustainability. This one is mostly influenced by biases, so it will follow the same one as the top one. So the y-axis is actually an actual value that we got from the surveys, the need for sustainability. So it was 0.13. You can see the equation in the paper, and you'll see the same as the top. When our supporting biases is at a maximum, it doesn't matter if we have a higher capacity for biases. As soon as the opposing biases take over the supporting biases, we diminish the need for sustainability and that perceived need for sustainability. And actually the most interesting one for me, and the one that actually shocked me because I didn't think about it while I was doing the model, you see the bell, the curve there. And we looked at the mental models of the survey respondents, when the opposing biases and when the supporting biases play a role. And you'll see at the start with the initial base case values, you reach a maximum and a peak. So this tells you that whether you have a lot of opposing or a lot of supporting biases, somewhere the mental models will peak and diminish. And when I had to go look at the literature on why this happens, it's that business as usual effect. So even if I have more supporting biases, if society has already reached a sustainable era and a sustainable environment, then people perceive it as it's already been reached. I do not have an effect of biases on it anymore. And then your mental models will deplete again, and there won't be an influence of biases specifically on sustainability or the circular economy in this case. So what we wanted to show just is that biases isn't a singular influence on the circular economy. You have to look at two different ones and what the influence is of the opposing and supporting on the actual mental model of the respondents and of the people in the circular economy. We can use this practically to make sure that at the start we know that it's important to have supporting biases. To know initially we need interventions to make sure that the mental models of the consumers are more sustainably driven and are in the right direction. But later on you can see it doesn't matter that much anymore. That's actually showing you the urgency of why we need to make sure that consumers and policymakers have the correct mental model at the start. Just in closing, I just want to acknowledge that this is a simplified model, and we do suggest some further research. What we are going to do is to delve into a more sophisticated model, add some of the additional data that we haven't used in this model from the surveys, and then explore some practical interventions that are currently out there and just time it at the correct time point. And then what I also want to just bring to you today is to make sure that we don't see biases as barriers. I think most people see them as a negative thing, but we now see it's more about the relationship between the two, and that we can focus on some and make sure that the supportive biases are improved without necessarily minimizing the negative biases. Thank you very much. I'll end on that.